The road has always been a place where stories begin, and where some, inexplicably, end. It was on a cold November night in 1991 when the hum of a diesel engine faded into the dark along Interstate 80, carrying with it a man who would never return. His name was Harold Jenkins, a seasoned trucker with a reputation for reliability, a man whose life was measured in miles and rest stops, in the steady rhythm of wheels against asphalt. But that night, somewhere between the flickering glow of highway lamps and the endless stretch of Nebraska farmland, Harold and his rig, a weathered but sturdy Kenworth Woo 900, vanished without so much as a whispered dot. No distress call, no signs of struggle, no wreckage, just silence. The dispatch log showed he'd checked in at a truck stop in Corny, his voice steady over the radio, his words unremarkable. Fueling up, then it's another 6 hours to Denver. But Denver never saw him. The next morning, when his scheduled delivery failed to arrive, the calls began. His wife, Linda, would later tell investigators how she knew something was wrong the moment the phone rang at 3 a.m., not because Harold was late, but because the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was a state trooper, his tone careful, his words clipped. "Ma'am, we've got no record of his rig passing the way station. No one's seen him since last night." And just like that, a man who had spent 2 decades crisscrossing the country, who knew every back road and shortcut, had slipped through the cracks of the world as if he'd never existed at all. Rumors, as they always do, filled the void. Some said he'd been carrying something he shouldn't have, drugs, maybe, or cash for the wrong people. Others whispered about foul play, about a shadowy figure seen lurking near his truck that night, half glimpsed in the dim light of the parking lot. A few even claimed Harold had simply walked away, tired of the road, ready to start over somewhere no one would think to look. But those who knew him, really knew him, shook their heads. Harold Jenkins didn't run. He didn't disappear, and he sure as hell didn't abandon his truck. Yet, for 22 years, that's exactly what the world believed. Until the day the concrete spoke. Now, as the dust settles over this decades-old mystery, one question lingers, heavy and unshaken. What happened in those lost hours between the truck stop and the dawn that never came for Harold Jenkins? And more importantly, who wanted him gone enough to bury the truth beneath tons of hardened stone? The road remembers. And tonight, so will you. The road was his kingdom, the night his only companion, before the silence swallowed him whole, before his rig became a ghost, buried beneath cold concrete. He was a man of rhythm, a solitary traveler, bound to the hum of the highway. His name was whispered in truck stops from Texas to Ohio, a fleeting presence who left behind only the scent of diesel and the echo of a half-finished coffee. The road knew him better than any face in the crowd. It knew the way his fingers drummed the steering wheel to old country tunes, the way his breath fogged the windshield on winter nights, when exhaustion pulled him toward the edge of sleep. He was a phantom in motion, a man who existed in the spaces between here and gone. His routine was a litany of quiet rituals: the pre-dawn clatter of a diner plate, eggs over easy, toast burned just enough to crunch, the weight of his thermos in the cup holder, steam curling into the cab like a ghost, the CB radio crackling with voices, some familiar, most not, each one a lifeline in the vast, indifferent dark. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the gravel of too many miles, too many nights spent watching the white lines blur beneath him. The truckers, who crossed his path, remembered him not for his words, but for the way he listened, as if every story told at a rest stop was a secret he might need to carry with him. Yet the road was a cruel mistress. It gave him freedom, but stole his stillness. It offered horizons, but no home. The loneliness was a living thing, pressing against the windows of his cab, slipping in through the vents. He fought it with small comforts: a dog-eared photo of his daughter tucked behind the visor, a cassette tape of her voice recorded on a birthday long past. Sometimes, When the static on the radio grew too loud, he'd play it just to remember what it sounded like to be Miss Dot. And then there were the others, the fleeting connections that flickered like roadside neon. A waitress in Albuquerque who always saved him a slice of pie. An old mechanic in Kansas who'd check his brakes for free if he stayed to share a beer. These were the threads that kept him from unraveling, fragile and temporary as they were. But threads can snap. And one night in October 1991, as his rig rolled toward a delivery that would never be made, the last of them frayed into silence. About waits in the dark between exits. What whispers ride the wind when no one's left to hear? The road took his answers, and for 22 years it kept them buried. The highway stretched empty that November night in 1991, the same way it had for countless miles before. Except this time, the rumble of his engine never returned. When the sun rose, his rig was gone. No distress call, no skid marks on the asphalt, just silence. And in that silence, something darker began to take root. The first 48 hours were a blur of frantic phone calls and dashed hopes. His wife, Linda, traced his last known route with trembling fingers over a crumpled map, her voice breaking as she begged dispatchers for answers they didn't have. The state troopers combed the rest stops, the diners where he'd grab coffee at 3 a.m., the truck stops where he'd swap stories with other drivers, all the places where a man like him might vanish into the rhythm of the road. But the road gave nothing back, not a single witness, not a scrap of evidence, only the cold hum of static when they patched through to his CB handle. Midnight Holler, one last time. Then came the whispers. The locals in the small towns along his route spoke in hushed tones over countertops, sticky with syrup, their eyes darting toward the abandoned factories on the outskirts. You hear about that trucker? They say he wasn't alone that night. Some folks don't just disappear for no reason. The theories slithered through the community, like smoke, thickening the air with unease. A rig that size doesn't vanish without a trace, unless someone wanted it to. Authorities dragged the nearby quarries, their floodlights cutting through the black water like knives. Search dogs picked up his scent near an old textile mill, only to lose it where the concrete foundation met the earth, seamless and unbroken. The timeline didn't add up. The last fuel receipt placed him 200 miles from home, but his logbook, meticulous always, ended mid-sentence, as if the pen had been ripped from his hand. And then there was the call. A single, garbled transmission. At 2:17 a.m., too distorted to decipher, too brief to trace. Not alone was all the text could pull from the noise. Linda sat by the window for weeks, her coffee gone cold, watching the road for headlights that never came. The community tied yellow ribbons to mailboxes, but the gestures felt hollow as the days turned to months, because deep down, they all knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a man who'd simply driven off the edge of the map. This was something else, something buried. And in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, the one thing no one could explain was why no one had seen a thing. The whispers that grew like shadows, as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. The absence of the trucker, once a familiar face at the roadside diner, a steady presence on the long-haul routes, became something else entirely. Not just a missing man, but a void, one that the small town could not help but fill with its own dark imaginings. Because in places like this, where the night stretches long and the highways hum with secrets, silence is never truly empty. It is a canvas, and fear is the artist. At first, the theories were cautious, tinged with hope. Maybe he'd taken a wrong turn, lost in the maze of back roads that snake through the county. Perhaps the rig had stalled in some forgotten stretch of desert, its driver wandering until help came, or until it didn't. But then, the whispers took a sharper turn. Locals began to speak of the trucker's last known route, a winding path that cut too close to the old factory on the outskirts of town. The place had been shuttered for years, its windows shattered, its walls groaning under the weight of something unseen. Some swore they'd heard engines idling in the dead of night, long after the last shift had ended. Others claimed to have seen lights flickering in the upper floors, though the power had been cut decades before. And then came the darker murmurs. Foul play. A deal gone wrong. The trucker, after all, wasn't just a driver. He was a man who knew things, who carried more than cargo between towns. There were debts, they said, unpaid favors, a ledger that didn't balance. The sheriff's office dismissed it as barroom gossip. But the doubt had already taken root, coiling around the town like ivy. Families locked their doors a little earlier. Truckers passing through avoided the usual stops, their CB radios crackling with warnings. Even the air felt different, thick with the weight of something unsaid, something buried. But the most chilling theory of all, that he had never left at all. That the factory, with its hollowed-out bones and its hunger for silence, had swallowed him whole. It was the kind of story told in hushed tones over coffee gone cold, the kind that made men glance over their shoulders when the wind howled through the empty loading docks. Because in a place where the land remembers, disappearance isn't an ending, it's an invitation. And for 22 years the town would wait, unaware that the truth was already beneath their feet, encased in concrete, waiting to be unearthed. So tell me, when the rumors spiral like this, when the line between fear and fact blurs, what do you believe? And more importantly, what would you have done if the whispers had started about someone you loved? And then there was the factory. It stood on the outskirts of town, like a relic of forgotten industry, its skeletal frame sagging under decades of neglect. The Larkin manufacturing plant, once a booming hub of steel and sweat, had been abandoned in the late 70s after a series of financial scandals and a fire that left half the building gutted. But the fire hadn't been the end. No, the real decay had come after, when the doors were chained shut and the windows boarded up. Yet whispers clung to the place like rust to iron. Locals spoke of strange lights flickering in the upper floors years after the power was cut. Others swore they'd heard machinery groan in the dead of night, though the assembly lines had been silent for decades. And then there were the stories about the concrete floor. A slab poured in haste, they said. In the weeks after the trucker vanished, the air around the factory was thick with something more than dust. It carried the weight of secrets, the kind that pressed down on a place until the very walls seemed to exhale them. The chain-link fence, half collapsed and strung with yellowed caution tape, did little to keep out the curious or the desperate. Graffiti scarred the brickwork, but even the vandalism felt hesitant, as if the artists had been chased away by something unseen. Inside, the scent of damp concrete and old oil hung heavy, mingling with the metallic tang of rusted catwalks. Puddles of stagnant water reflected the fractured ceiling, turning the beams into jagged teeth in the dim light. And beneath it all, beneath the peeling paint and the rotting support beams, lay the floor, a seamless expanse of concrete, poured too smooth, too deliberate, as if someone had wanted to ensure nothing beneath it would ever surface again. For years, the factory had been a cautionary tale, a place parents warned their children away from with hushed urgency. But in the summer of 2013, when the demolition crew arrived with their jackhammers and their blueprints, no one expected the ground to answer back. The foreman later said the air had gone still. The moment the first crack split the concrete, no wind, no birds, just the echo of the drill biting into stone. And then, the unmistakable hollow thud beneath. Something was down there, something that had been waiting. And as the crew peeled back the layers of that unnatural slab, one question burned brighter than the rest. What else had they buried here? Not just the truck, not just the man, but the truth. Whatever it was, had been sealed away for 22 years, and now it was breathing again. The air inside the abandoned factory was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust, a silent testament to decades of neglect. The demolition crew had spent weeks tearing through its skeletal remains, their heavy machinery groaning under the weight of time-worn steel and crumbling masonry. But on that particular morning, cold, with a gray sky pressing down like a shroud, something felt off. The usual banter between the workers had dulled to uneasy silence. their breaths visible in the frigid air as they moved with a caution that wasn't just professional, it was instinctual. Then came the first strike. The excavator's claw bit into the factory floor, and instead of the expected crunch of old concrete, there was a hollow thud, deep, resonant, like striking the lid of a coffin. The operator froze, his fingers tightening around the controls. He swung the arm back, then lowered it again, this time with deliberate slowness. The crew gathered around, their bootsteps echoing in the cavernous space. One of them, a veteran with a face lined by years of hard labor, spat onto the ground and muttered something about bad energy. No one laughed. The foreman signaled for the jackhammer. The first blow sent a spider web of cracks snaking across the slab, but the second revealed something that made the blood drain from their faces. Not rebar, not pipes, metal curved, rusted, unmistakably the corner of a vehicle's frame. The men exchanged glances, their breath quickening. One of them reached down, brushing away the dust, and his fingers traced the unmistakable outline of a truck's grille, half buried, like a fossil in the earth. The realization hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't just debris, this was a grave. The foreman radioed for the police, but the minutes stretched like hours as they waited, the factory's shadows seeming to press closer. One of the younger workers kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the walls themselves to whisper secrets. And then, just as the first squad car's siren wailed in the distance, the beam of a flashlight caught something else. A glint, a license plate, still clinging to the rusted bumper, its numbers barely legible, but unmistakable to those who knew the old missing persons reports. The air turned electric. This wasn't just any truck. It was his. And after 22 years of silence, the earth had finally decided to give him back. The moment the demolition crew's jackhammer cracked through the final layer of concrete, they didn't just uncover a truck. They unearthed a secret, buried with deliberate, chilling precision. This was no accident, no careless oversight. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that this rig, and whatever it carried, would never see the light of day again. The truck wasn't simply abandoned. It was entombed, sealed beneath a slab so thick it would take decades and sheer chance for the truth to surface. Consider the logistics of such an act. Concrete doesn't pour itself. The weight of the material alone would have required careful calculation, a methodical approach to ensure the truck was completely submerged. The perpetrator, or perpetrators, would have needed time, tools, and an unsettling level of determination. This wasn't the work of a panicked decision made in the heat of the moment. It was a cold, calculated erasure, the kind that suggests premeditation, perhaps even a twisted sense of finality. The truck wasn't hidden. It was disposed of, like evidence in a case where the stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. And then there's the question of why. What could have driven someone to such extremes? Desperation has a way of warping judgment, of course, but this went beyond mere desperation. This was the act of someone who believed they had no other choice, or worse, someone who wanted the truck to vanish forever. Was it fear, guilt, or something darker, a secret so damaging that even the passage of time couldn't be trusted to bury it? The concrete itself becomes a character in this story, a silent witness to the terror of the moment it was poured, sealing the truck and its driver's fate beneath its unyielding weight. Now, place yourself in the shoes of those who stood over that freshly exposed rig, the air thick with dust, and the ghost of a decision made 2 decades prior. What must they have felt, staring into the cab of that truck, knowing it had been locked away, not by nature, but by human hands? The implications stretch far beyond the physical act. This wasn't just about hiding a vehicle. It was about hiding a truth, and truths, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. So ask yourself, what kind of secret is worth burying in concrete? And what does it say about the person who buried it? The answers may lie just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. The weight of truth. When hope collides with the unthinkable. The moment the excavator's claw struck metal, It wasn't just steel groaning beneath the weight of 2 decades. It was the sound of a family's fragile hope shattering. For 22 years they had clung to the possibility that he was still out there, somewhere. A wrong turn, a stolen rig, even an escape into a new life. Anything but this. But as the concrete crumbled away like the lies they'd told themselves, the truth emerged in rusted chrome and faded paint. He had never left. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. The call came at dawn. The kind of call no one ever answers without their hands trembling. His sister, now silver-haired and stooped with years of waiting, collapsed to her knees before the phone even hit the floor. The voice on the other end was clinical, detached, a detective reciting facts, like they were just another case file. "We found the truck." 3 words that carried the weight of a coffin. His wife, who had long since stopped setting a place for him at the table, but still kept his favorite mug in the cabinet, let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, not quite a sob, just raw, unfiltered grief, clawing its way out after years of silence. Their son, barely a boy when his father vanished, now a man with children of his own, stood frozen, his mind racing through every birthday, every graduation, every milestone his father had missed. And then, the question that had haunted them all. If the truck was here, where was he? The answers didn't come. Not then. Not in the way they needed. The factory had been abandoned for years. Its records lost to time and neglect. The concrete had been poured with purpose. Thick, deliberate. The work of someone who wanted this secret to stay buried. Forensic teams swarmed the site, their flashlights cutting through the dust like knives, revealing fragments of a life interrupted. A half-empty thermos, still in the cup holder, a logbook, with the last entry scrawled in hurried handwriting, the keys still in the ignition, as if he'd stepped away for just a moment. But the cab was empty. No remains, no blood, just the ghost of a man who had driven into the unknown and never returned. And then, the whispers started, the kind that slither through small towns like smoke, carrying names and motives, and half-remembered arguments. The foreman, who had vanished a month after the truck, the rival driver with a grudge and no alibi, the factory owner who sold the land too quickly, too quietly, each theory a new wound, reopening the old ones before they'd even had time to scar. The family stood at the edge of the pit, staring into the hollow eyes of the rig, their reflections warped in the cracked windshield. They had spent years begging the world to remember him. Now, they wished they could forget. But the truth doesn't care about wishes. It only cares about being found. And as the sun set over the excavation site, casting long shadows over the evidence bags and the weary faces of the investigators, one thing became painfully clear. This was never just about a missing truck. It was about a man who had been erased, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it that way. The question now wasn't just what happened, but who was still out there, watching, waiting, hoping their own secrets stayed buried just a little while longer. So tell me, when the answers finally come, will they bring peace, or will they only deepen the darkness? The shadows of doubt stretched long over the abandoned factory floor, as investigators stood before the concrete tomb, their flashlights carving jagged paths through the dust-choked air. For 22 years, the disappearance of trucker Harold Voss had festered like an open wound in the collective memory of this quiet town. Now, with his rig unearthed, the questions were no longer if he had vanished, but who had ensured he stayed buried. And as the concrete was pried away, so too were the layers of deception surrounding those who may have wanted him gone forever. 3 names surfaced first, whispered in the dim corners of police interviews and old case files, each carrying the weight of motive and opportunity. There was Frank Delaney, Voss's former business partner, a man whose financial records told a story of embezzlement and desperation in the months leading up to 1991. Then, Marlene Carter, the factory foreman's daughter, rumored to have been the last person seen arguing with Voss the night he disappeared, her alibi as flimsy as the rusted chain-link fence that once guarded the property. And finally, Eddie Rourke, a low-level enforcer for the local syndicate, whose name had been scribbled in the margins of a detective's notebook decades ago, paired with a single chilling word: silenced. The investigation that followed was a labyrinth of dead ends and half-truths. Forensic teams meticulously combed the truck's cabin, extracting fibers that didn't match Voss's usual attire, a smudge of dried blood on the driver's side door handle, and a single, out-of-place business card, Delaney and Voss Logistics, creased as if it had been clenched in a fist. Handwriting analysis on a crumpled receipt found in the glove compartment suggested Voss had been lured to the factory under false pretenses. The scrawled timestamp, placing him there at 11:47 p.m., just hours before his last known cell tower ping. Meanwhile, ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbances in the soil beneath the factory's loading dock, hinting at a second, still-hidden grave dot. But the most haunting clue was the concrete itself. Tests confirmed it had been poured in stages, the first layer laid within days of Voss's disappearance, the final seal added months later, suggesting not just a crime of passion, but a calculated, almost industrial effort to erase him. Witnesses from the era spoke of late-night deliveries of cement mix, of unfamiliar trucks idling near the factory gates, their drivers silent and watchful. And then there were the phone records, a flurry of calls between Delaney's office and a payphone half a mile from the factory, all placed in the dead of night, all lasting less than 30 seconds. Just long enough to say, "It's done." As the web of suspicion tightened, investigators found themselves tangled in a question darker than the case itself. How does a man vanish beneath a town's nose, only to be found when the town itself begins to crumble? The answers lay buried, not just in the concrete, but in the silence of those who had watched, who had known, and who had chosen to let the secret harden over time. And now, with the truth finally clawing its way to the surface, one had to wonder who else was waiting to be found. Who else had been poured over and forgotten? The whispers began like a slow, creeping fog, first in the diners where truckers gathered over steaming cups of coffee, then in the pews of the old brick church, where families bowed their heads a little longer on Sundays. Something had been unearthed. Not just steel and rust, not just the skeletal remains of a rig long forgotten, but a truth so heavy it pressed down on the town, like the weight of the concrete that had hidden it for decades. The discovery of the trucker's buried rig didn't just answer questions, it cracked open a wound the community had learned to live with, stitching it shut with silence and half-truths. Now the stitches were coming undone, and the pain was raw again. For years, they had told themselves stories to fill the void. Some said he'd run, started over somewhere new, unable to face the life he'd left behind. Others clung to darker theories: foul play, a deal gone wrong, a man erased by forces no one dared name. But concrete doesn't lie. Neither do the records that surfaced afterward. The ones that showed his last known route, the fuel receipts, the logbook entries that stopped mid-sentence, as if the words themselves had been swallowed by the night. The truth was worse than the rumors. It was final. It was real. And it forced the town to confront what they'd buried alongside him, their own complicity in forgetting Dot. The ripple effect started with the families. The trucker's sister, now silver-haired, clutched a faded photograph at the press conference, her voice trembling as she spoke of the brother who'd never come home. But it didn't stop there. The wives of his fellow drivers wept in their kitchens, remembering the way their husbands had flinched at every late-night phone call in the years after. The children, now grown, who'd played in the shadows of the factory where the rig was found, suddenly saw their childhood haunts through different eyes. Even the old-timers at the hardware store, the ones who'd scoffed at the search parties back in '91, stood a little straighter, their guilt a tangible thing, like the dust settling on their shoulders. And then there were the others, the ones who knew, the foreman who'd retired quietly the year the factory closed, whose hands shook when the news broke, the night shift workers who'd traded glances but never words, their silence bought with fear or money or both. The discovery didn't just expose a buried truck, it exposed the fragile, unspoken pact a town makes with its secrets. Now, the pact was broken. The questions came faster than the answers. Who else was involved? What else was hidden beneath their feet? Cloth, the trust that had held this place together, thin as ice over a frozen lake, began to crack. As the days turned to weeks, the grief became a shared thing. Candles flickered in windows. Strangers hugged on street corners. The local radio station played his favorite songs between updates, the DJ's voice thick with something more than professional sorrow. It was as if the town had collectively held its breath for 22 years. And now, finally, it could exhale. But the air tasted bitter. Closure, they were learning, wasn't the neat, tidy thing they'd imagined. It was jagged. It left scars. So now, as the investigators sift through the last of the evidence and the news vans pack up their satellites, we're left with this, a story that isn't just about one man's disappearance, but about the weight of what we choose to remember and what we choose to bury. Look around you. How many secrets do your streets hold? How many absences have you learned to live with? The next time you hear a rumor, the next time you turn away from a question because the answer might hurt too much, ask yourself, what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? And more importantly, are you ready to face it? The weight of what lies beneath. There is a silence that lingers in the air after a mystery is solved, a silence heavier than the one that came before, because now the unknown has a shape, it has edges, a form, a place in the world where it can be pointed to, touched, mourned. But does that make it any easier to bear? When the trucker's rig was pulled from its concrete tomb, the rusted metal and faded paint didn't just reveal a vehicle. They uncovered a wound that had never truly healed, one that the community had learned to carry like a shadow. The discovery was not an ending. It was an invitation to look deeper, to ask what it means when the lost are found. But the questions remain. For 22 years, the absence of the trucker had been a hollow space in the lives of those who knew him. A husband who never came home, a father whose voice faded from memory, a coworker whose jokes were repeated like echoes, growing quieter with time. The mind has a way of filling voids with stories, some hopeful, some haunted, but none of them prepare you for the moment when the truth emerges, raw and unyielding. The concrete that entombed his truck was more than a barrier. It was a metaphor, because grief, too, hardens over time. It sets. It becomes part of the foundation of who we are, invisible but always there, bearing weight we don't even realize we've been carrying. And what of the community? A place like this, where everyone knows the rhythm of the streets and the faces that belong to them, doesn't just lose a person, it loses a piece of its identity. The trucker's disappearance had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered over diner counters and in the cab of late-night halls. But legends are easier to live with than truths, because truths demand reckoning. They force you to confront not just what happened, but what it means, that safety is an illusion, that the road home is never guaranteed, that some questions are answered only to reveal deeper ones. How does a town move forward when the past refuses to stay buried? The human heart is a contradictory thing. It craves closure, yet resists it. It wants to know, but fears what knowing might unravel. The discovery of the truck didn't just bring answers, it brought a reckoning with time, with memory, with the fragile nature of the stories we tell ourselves to keep going. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but to be carried, to be felt, to remind us that the line between the lost and the found is thinner than we think. So now, as the investigation presses on, as reports are filed and evidence is examined, take a moment to sit with the weight of this, not just as a story, but as a mirror. What does it mean to seek the lost? And when they are found, what then? Do we finally let go, or do we simply learn to hold them differently? The road ahead is long, and the answers may not come easily. But perhaps the searching itself is the point. Perhaps the yearning for understanding is the only closure we ever truly get. The air in the precinct was thick with the weight of decades-old secrets, each file pulled from the archives, carrying the faint scent of dust and faded ink. For 22 years, the case of the vanished trucker had gathered cobwebs in the minds of investigators, a cold trail that refused to warm until the day the concrete tomb was cracked open. Now the walls of the interrogation rooms seemed to hum with a quiet urgency, as if the very building had been holding its breath since 1991. The police reports, yellowed with age, told a story not just of a missing man, but of a system that had failed to see what was buried in plain sight. Witness statements from the era painted a picture of confusion and half-truths. A diner waitress recalled the trucker's last meal, a half-eaten plate of meatloaf, his usual order, left behind as if he'd been called away mid-bite. A fellow driver swore he'd seen the rig parked near the factory that night, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin blades, but his testimony had been dismissed as exhaustion talking. Then there were the factory workers, their voices trembling as they described the late-night deliveries of concrete, the way the foreman had insisted on pouring an extra slab in the dead of winter. No one had asked why. No one had dared. The forensic evidence, when it finally emerged, was a gut punch to the investigation. The truck's cab was pristine, almost too pristine, as if it had been wiped clean by hands that knew exactly what they were erasing. The seat was adjusted for a driver of average height, but the steering wheel bore the faintest grooves, too deep for the missing man's documented grip. Someone else had been behind the wheel that night, someone who didn't want to be found. The atmosphere in those final days before the revelations broke was electric, charged with the kind of tension that makes a detective's instincts scream. The community, too, felt it, the way the wind carried whispers through the streets, how neighbors locked eyes over fences and knew, without speaking, that the truth was closer than it had ever been. But truth is a fragile thing when it's been buried for so long. It doesn't always surface whole. It doesn't always surface kind. And so, as the pieces began to fit together, one question lingered, heavy as the concrete that had hidden them for so long. What happens when the answers we seek are not the ones we're prepared to face? The trucker's story was no longer just about a man who vanished. It was about the hands that made him disappear, and the ones that had, knowingly or not, helped keep him that way. The investigation had cracked open more than a cold case. It had cracked open a mirror. And now, the town had to decide if it was ready to look inside. The air in the precinct had grown thick with the weight of unanswered questions, until the day the ground itself decided to speak. Beneath the cracked concrete of the abandoned Miller and Sons textile factory, where the hum of machinery had long since faded into silence, something metallic groaned in protest as the demolition crew's excavator clawed through decades of neglect. At first, it was just a glint, something unnatural in the dirt, a curve of rusted steel that didn't belong to the factory's skeletal remains. Then came the unmistakable shape of a truck's grill, half buried like a relic from another time. And there, still visible beneath the grime, was the faded logo of Midwest Haulage, the same company that had reported driver James Calloway missing in the fall of 1991. The discovery didn't just ripple through the investigation. It detonated like a grenade in a room full of old case files. For 22 years, the prevailing theory had been that Calloway had either fled or met with foul play on some lonely stretch of highway. But this was deliberate. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide not just a man, but an entire 18-wheeler beneath tons of concrete. The question was no longer where James had vanished, but why his truck had been entombed like a secret too dangerous to surface. Detective Carla Voss, who had inherited the cold case from a retired predecessor, stood at the edge of the excavation pit, her breath visible in the autumn chill. The forensic team moved with methodical precision, but their hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the understanding that this wasn't just a burial. It was a message. The truck's cab was compressed, as if crushed by something far heavier than concrete. The passenger door had been welded shut from the outside. And then there were the tire tracks, freshly preserved in the dried mud beneath the slab, leading away from the site, suggesting whatever had happened here hadn't been the work of one person. The community, once resigned to the idea that some mysteries were meant to stay buried, now buzzed with a terrifying energy. At the Silver Dollar Diner, where James had eaten his last meal, old-timers whispered about the factory's former foreman, a man named Harlan Duval, who'd vanished himself just months after James. Over at the county records office, a clerk dug up blueprints, showing the factory's floor had been poured twice, once in 1991 and again in 1993, under a shell company no one could trace. The pieces were there, scattered like breadcrumbs, but the path they formed led into darker woods than anyone had imagined. And then there was the smell. When they finally breached the cab, it hit them, a sour metallic tang beneath the must of decay. Not just rust, not just time, something organic. The coroner's preliminary report would later confirm it. Traces of blood, too degraded for DNA, but enough to suggest James hadn't walked away from this place. The investigation, once a file gathering dust, now had teeth, but teeth sink deepest when they bite into flesh, and whatever had happened here had left more than just a truck behind Dot. So now we stand at the precipice of a truth that's been waiting, patient as a predator, for someone to dig it up. What do you do when the earth gives back what was stolen from it? Do you run, or do you keep digging? Even when the deeper you go, the less you want to find. The weight of waiting, a family's fragile hope, in the shadow of concrete. For 22 years, the Holloway family had learned to live with the silence. A silence so thick, it settled into the walls of their home. The empty chair at Thanksgiving, the way Margaret Holloway's hands would still pause, mid-air, when she reached to set a second coffee mug on the table. They had buried their questions beneath routine, their grief beneath the weight of the unknown. But when the call came that the rig had been found, not lost to time or rust, but entombed, deliberately sealed beneath layers of concrete, like a secret too dark to surface, the silence shattered, and in its place came something far more brutal. Hope. Hope is a cruel thing when it arrives uninvited. It doesn't knock. It kicks the door in, flooding the room with light, just long enough to reveal the dust, still settling on the things you'd stopped daring to touch. For the Holloways, it was the scent of diesel on their father's work shirt, preserved in a plastic bag in the attic. The way his favorite radio station still played static in the old cab of his truck, now exposed to air for the first time in decades. Hope made them wonder, if the truck was here all along, where was he? The answers didn't come. Not yet. Instead, there were more questions, each one a fresh wound. Why concrete? Who would go to such lengths to hide a man's last known resting place? The investigators spoke in measured tones about timelines and forensic processes, but the family heard only the echo of their own pulses. Every day without resolution stretched the tension thinner between them, between the past and the present, between the need to know and the terror of what that knowledge might bring. And then there were the nights. The way Margaret would wake to the sound of gravel crunching under tires, only to find the driveway empty. The way young Tommy, just a boy when his father vanished, now stood in the doorway of his childhood home, staring at the phone like it might ring with a voice from 1991. The mind plays tricks when it's starved for closure. A shadow becomes a figure. A creak in the floorboards becomes a footprint. The truck's discovery hadn't given them answers. It had given them ghosts. Yet beneath the heartbreak, something stubborn persisted. A refusal to let the story end like this. Not in a police report, not in a cold case file, but in the way it had begun, with a man who loved his family, who kissed his wife goodbye on a Tuesday morning, who never came home. The Holloways had spent over 2 decades learning to carry the weight of his absence. Now they had to learn something harder, how to stand in the glare of renewed attention, to endure the whispers and the theories, to wait again, this time, with their eyes wide open. So they wait, and in the waiting, they remember the way his laugh filled a room, the way he'd hum old country tunes off key while fixing the sink, the way he'd promised, the night before he disappeared, that he'd be back by Friday, always by Friday. Some promises outlive the people who make them. Some questions outlast the answers, and some families, they outlast the silence. But at what cost? Pause for a moment. Close your eyes. Imagine the last words you spoke to someone you loved, words so ordinary you didn't know they'd become sacred. Now ask yourself, could you bear to hear them again, knowing they were the last? The Holloways don't have that choice. Their story isn't over, and neither, perhaps, is his. The air hung thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust as the demolition crew's jackhammers fell silent, because something wasn't right. Beneath the cracked slab of the abandoned factory's loading bay, the earth had resisted, not with the stubbornness of rebar or old piping, but with the unnatural weight of something buried. The foreman's flashlight trembled as it cut through the dust, landing on a glint of chrome, just a fragment at first, then more, a fender, a wheel well, and then, unmistakably, the cab of a Freightliner, its once vibrant red paint, now dulled to the color of dried blood, sealed beneath the concrete like a secret the ground had kept for decades. For 22 years, the case of Harold Voss had been a ghost story whispered in truck stops from Ohio to Oklahoma. A man who vanished mid-haul, his rig disappearing with him, as if swallowed by the night. Theories had spiraled foul play. A life abandoned, even the wild conjecture that he'd staged his own escape. But no one had imagined this. No one had dared to picture his truck, not stolen, not scrapped, but entombed, deliberately hidden beneath a floor poured in haste, the concrete still bearing the faint impressions of hurried workmanship. The investigators' radios crackled with a tension that needed no words. This wasn't an accident. This was a grave. Then came the first glimpse inside the cab. The seat, still adjusted to the recline of a man settling in for a long haul, was split down the middle, the foam spilling out like guts. A thermos, its stainless steel surface, pitted with rust, rolled onto the floorboards with a hollow clang, and there, wedged beneath the dashboard, a single Polaroid, its edges curled with time, showing a face the world hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Harold's face, but his expression wasn't one of fear. It was something worse, recognition, as if in his final moments, he'd known exactly what or who was coming for him. The coroner's team moved in with a solemn precision, their gloves snapping into place like the final seal on a pact long broken. Because this wasn't just a discovery, it was a confession. The concrete hadn't just hidden a truck, it had preserved a crime scene, untouched by time, waiting for the day when the truth would claw its way back to the surface. And now, as the last chunks of slab were pried away, one question burned hotter than the rest. If Harold's rig had been buried here, in a factory that changed hands 3 times before its abandonment, then who had the power to make a man and his truck disappear? And more chilling still, who had been protecting them all these years? The answers were coming, and they would shake this town to its foundations. The truth, once buried beneath layers of concrete and decades of silence, now clawed its way into the light, and with it came a storm of emotions that would shake the small town to its core. For 22 years, the disappearance of the trucker had been a wound left unstitched, a question mark etched into the collective memory of those who knew him. But now, as the rusted rig emerged from its tomb, the answers carried a weight no one was prepared to bear. The factory floor, once a symbol of industry and progress, had become a graveyard of secrets, and when the news broke, it spread like wildfire through the streets, whispered in diners, shouted in living rooms, each voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and dawning horror. His family, who had clung to hope like a lifeline, now stood at the edge of a chasm, grief they thought they'd already endured, resurfacing with brutal clarity. His wife, her hands trembling around a faded photograph, traced the edges of his face, as if trying to memorize him all over again. The children, now grown, found themselves caught between the relief of knowing and the agony of how they knew. One daughter, her voice breaking, would later say it felt like losing him twice, once to the unknown, and again to the cruel certainty of what had been done to him. But the ripples didn't stop there. The truckers who had shared the road with him, who had swapped stories at rest, stops and clinked coffee mugs in the dead of night, now carried the weight of a brother, lost to something darker than any highway legend. Some burned with anger, their fists clenched at the thought of justice delayed for so long. Others sank into a quiet sorrow, their rigs rolling down the same routes he once drove, now haunted by his absence. And then there were those who had worked at the factory, whose shifts had unknowingly walked them over his resting place. Guilt gnawed at them. Could they have known? Should they have seen? The town itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with unspoken questions. Had this been an accident covered up? A crime hidden in plain sight? Or something even more sinister? A conspiracy of silence that had let the truth rot beneath their feet? The police tapes, now dusted off and re-examined, buzzed with static and half-remembered testimonies, each one a thread pulling at the frayed edges of a story someone had tried desperately to bury. And yet, in the midst of the turmoil, something unexpected began to take shape. Strangers left flowers at the factory's chain-link fence, their petals pressed against the rust, like offerings to the past. Vigils were held in the parking lot, where his truck had last been seen, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on faces wet with tears. The pain was raw, but so was the need to remember, not just the horror of his end, but the life he'd lived. The jokes he'd told at truck stops, the way he'd hummed old country songs under his breath, the quiet kindness of a man who'd once pulled over to help a stranded family in a storm. Because that's the thing about truth. It doesn't just answer questions. It demands we feel them. And as the town grappled with the weight of what had been uncovered, one question lingered, heavier than the rest. How many other stories are still buried out there, waiting for the right hands to dig? The concrete had cracked, but the search for meaning, for justice, for peace, was only just beginning. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the man in the buried rig. A reminder that some truths refuse to stay hidden, no matter how deep they're buried. The question is, will we have the courage to keep looking?